Ever wondered which countries are dealing with serious racism issues right now? Today, we're diving into the top 10 countries facing the racism crisis head on, exploring the real challenges for diverse communities around the globe. Throughout our exploration, we'll uncover the systematic issues affecting diverse communities worldwide. Plus, we'll delve into the surprising history behind racial classifications that have shaped societies. I've explored many countries around the world, and I've discovered how racism began, which I will reveal to you today. This is Discover Globe Today. Let's explore these important stories together. First up, the United States at number 10. Racism has been a huge problem in the US, with a long history that still impacts society today. Slavery started in the 17th century, and even after its abolition, laws like Jim Crow enforced racial segregation and discrimination against Black Americans. Systematic inequalities persist in education, employment, housing, and healthcare. For example, Black Americans have higher poverty rates and lower median household incomes compared to white Americans. In 2020, the median income for Black households was $45,870 compared to $74,912 for white households. Hate crimes and police brutality incidents highlight ongoing racial biases, with the FBI reporting in 2019 that nearly half of hate crimes were race-motivated. Environmental racism disproportionately affects minority communities, placing them near industrial hazards. High-profile events like the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre and the Flint water crisis show these deep-rooted disparities. Next, let's fly to Sweden at number 9. Sweden seems super progressive, but it actually has a long history of racism and discrimination. Even though it's ranked as one of the happiest countries, it deals with a lot of systematic racism and intolerance. The Sami people and non-European immigrants have faced significant discrimination over the years. Sweden's labor market is the most segregated in Europe, with big gaps in employment and income. Cities also show high residential segregation, which limits opportunities for minorities. Sweden had one of the highest rates of hate crimes in Europe. Job applicants with Sweden-sounding names are 50% more likely to get interviews. Number 8. France. Racism in France is still a hot topic, despite the country seeing itself as colorblind. There's been a lot of recent incidents and stats showing it's a real issue. Like in June 2023, when Nael, a 17-year-old North African, got shot by a cop during a traffic stop. That set off riots all over, showing how tense things are between minorities and the police. Then in 2020, there was the case of Michel Zecler, a Black producer roughed up by cops in Paris, which sparked a big debate on racism in law enforcement. Stats from 2023 say 91% of Black people in Metro France face racial discrimination. Amnesty International says racism's deep-rooted in the police force. Now let's head to Iran at number 7. Ethnic groups like Turks, Kurds, Balochis, and Arabs face discrimination in schools, jobs, and politics. A UN expert in 2019 even called it systematic discrimination against these folks. There have been reports of security forces cracking down on peaceful protests by Kurds and Balochis, and neglecting basic needs like water in ethnic regions. Plus, there are language and cultural restrictions that make life even harder for minorities. Non-Shia religious groups like Baha'is and Christians also get a rough deal, facing all sorts of legal and social limits on their rights. On top of all that, Iran's got issues with gender discrimination, bias based on sexual orientation, and racism against people of different skin colors. The government denies it, but evidence shows these problems are still very real. Number 6. Myanmar. Myanmar has a serious racism problem, especially towards minorities like the Rohingya Muslims. This goes way back to colonial times when the British played favorites among ethnic groups, setting up divisions that stuck around after Myanmar got independence in 1948. In 2017, things got really bad with a military crackdown that pushed over 700,000 Rohingya to flee to Bangladesh. Myanmar's 2015 race and religion laws made things worse by restricting marriages between faiths and religious conversions. Now let's head to Israel at number 5. Israel has been accused of racism and discrimination against various ethnic and religious groups for decades, especially targeting Palestinians and non-white Jewish communities. One big problem is how Palestinians are treated under Israeli occupation in the West Bank of Gaza. Even with Israeli Jewish communities, there's racism. Ethiopian Jews have faced discrimination for years, like in the 2015 case where police officers assaulted an Ethiopian Israeli soldier. Mizrahi Jews from Arab countries also feel the divide compared to Ashkenazi Jews in areas like education and jobs. Recent events such as racist chants at marches and debates about deporting Eritrean refugees show tensions are still high. We're at number 4 now, and we're in Russia. Racism's still a big deal in Russia even though they've got equality in their constitution. Back then, they used racism to control non-Russian groups, and even after World War II, they kept up discrimination against folks from places like the Caucasus and Central Asia. Nowadays, Russia's seeing more of that ugly stuff. Lots of racist ideas and hate crimes happening. Amnesty International counted over 200 deaths from racist attacks between 2007 and 2010. Immigrants from Central Asia, the Caucasus, Africans, and Afro-Russians get the worst of it, facing discrimination in housing, jobs, and public areas. Number 3. Bahrain. In Bahrain, the majority of Shia Muslims often face discrimination, especially since Sunni Muslims dominate the government, affecting their jobs, housing, and political representation. During the Arab Spring, things got even worse when the government cracked down hard on Shia-led protests. It led to a lot of human rights abuses and accusations of ethnic cleansing. The expat workers, mainly from South and Southeast Asia, are a big part of Bahrain's workforce but get a raw deal. They deal with exploitation, lousy living conditions, and discrimination under the kafala system, which ties their legal status to their employers. There's also a lot of xenophobia and racial discrimination against people of African, South Asian, and Southeast Asian descent, with racial slurs and stereotypes flying around. Now let's travel to Lebanon at number 2. Lebanon deals with deep-rooted racism and discrimination due to its complex history and diverse population. You've got a mix of ethnic and religious groups in Lebanon, with Arabs in the majority and Armenians, Kurds, and others making up the rest. But historically, things have favored Christian Maronites, causing tension with other communities. Refugees from Syria and Palestine get a rough deal. They face discrimination in jobs, housing, and basic services. The UN says there are tons of unregistered births among Syrian refugees in Lebanon. Migrant workers from Asia and Africa play a big role in Lebanon's workforce, but they're often mistreated and abused under the kafala system. There are lots of reports of them facing physical abuse and racial insults. Anti-black racism is a big issue too, affecting both Lebanese people of African descent and African students at places like the American University of Beirut. And here we are at the top of our list, with India taking the number 1 spot for the most significant issues with racism. Racism and discrimination are deeply rooted in Indian society, stemming from the ancient caste system. Despite its abolition, remnants of caste-based prejudice persist. The caste system, dating back centuries, segregated society into hierarchical groups, leading to systematic oppression of lower castes known as Dalits or untouchables. Modern India still grapples with racism, particularly against communities like northeastern ethnic tribes, who face discrimination for their distinct physical features and cultural practices. The Indian diaspora, including in the US, reports caste-based discrimination in workplaces and education. Half of Indian Americans surveyed reported discrimination based on skin color. African students and expatriates in India also face racial slurs and violence. Addressing racism demands legal reform, education, and inclusive policies. Despite progress, deep-rooted prejudices persist, challenging equal opportunities for all. Want to keep exploring? Click on the next video to uncover the top 10 epicenters of racism in America. We'll dive into the historical and modern-day struggles that shape America's racial landscape.